Welcome to The Sound of Economics, and to another episode of Zhonghua Mundus, our series about global China as seen from Europe, which includes our monthly newsletter as well under the same name. The link to subscribe is in the show notes. I'm Yuyun Zhan, your host today, and I'm joined by Giuseppe Porcaro and Alicia Garcia Herrero, your usual hosts for this special series. Hello both, how are you?
Very well, it's a pleasure to be here.
Very well. Thank you for hosting us, Yuyun.
Thank you for joining me. So our listeners might be wondering why I'm the one hosting this episode today. Well, it is a quite special episode because since March 2021, we have released more than 30 editions of our China newsletter and our podcast, and each time focusing on one topic related to economic development in China, starting from which we discuss its implications for Europe and beyond. So we would like to use this moment to look back at some of our past discussions, check the developments, and see where they stand now. Are these problems resolved, or are they still impeding China's economic growth? And how are they shaping EU-China economic relations and beyond? But before we delve into these specific topics, maybe Alicia and Giuseppe can tell us a bit about what prompted you to start this newsletter in the first place.
Well, Yuyun, back in 2021 with Alicia, we were working quite a lot on the issue of China, but also on the issue about how Europe was seeing China back then. And we are speaking about like just 2 years ago, but it seems something like a decade that has passed from when we started this conversation, which actually even dated from 2020 during the pandemic. We started to have some episodes of The Sound of Economics dedicated to China. So the first idea was to try to explain to a global audience how the rise of China internationally was meaningful, or like what kind of impact it had on the European policymaking. So this was a little bit the challenge, because there wasn't really a space of this kind when it comes to the podcasts here in Europe. And also we were working quite a lot on the topic. Alicia was leading the research team of Bruegel on those topics, and we wanted to have a space in order to as well create a dialogue. And if I may say another thing, and then Alicia can complement, the idea from the beginning was also to mix voices from different sides, and mix voices from the ground. And on that, we've been experiencing some challenges and some evolutions during those years. And Alicia can say more about it.
Well, why did we do this? And that's the question, Yuyun. I think, frankly, if you think about it now, you would wonder why, because there's so many podcasts about China everywhere. But I guess when we started, there weren't so many in Europe. And I think we still have a niche here, which is we try to be based on economic issues. And yes, we sometimes, get deeper into geopolitics because it's very hard to avoid, but we try to stand somehow out of the strategic competition between the US and China. So we try to look at it, as objectively as possible. And to do that, we basically delve into the economics behind. And I think that is what differentiates our podcast. Having said that, even if we try very hard to stay there, and again, objectively look at China and its impact on the world and certainly on Europe, we find it extremely hard, harder than ever, because anything we look into gets polarized. And I think this is the reality of China and the world today, or the world on China today, because it doesn't go in one direction. I'm afraid it goes in both directions. So for me, our mission, and I'm really sorry that Giuseppe can't help anymore in this mission, is to try very hard to, stay grounded on the realities of things without being driven by, political situations. It is a bit hard because we sometimes can't really find researchers from the Chinese side to do this, unfortunately. But when we find them, we really grab them.
Yes.
And they're great. So I have to say, every instance, every opportunity will certainly continue to engage with Chinese researchers and observers. Beyond that, everybody else is welcome to.
Alicia mentioned that it's a pity that I don't continue. She had a little spoiler for our listeners. This is actually my last Zongwa Mundo podcast, maybe. I mean, definitely I'm already not the host of the podcast since Yuyun is there. So it's already past my last podcast to a certain extent because I'm a guest, but I'm leaving Bruegel, and I will tell more afterwards. So this is also a little bit of an emotional podcast for me.
Yeah, let's save the spoiler for the last. But it's true, like Giuseppe and Alicia, as you have mentioned, now there are just so many content about China, and also it has been very fast 2 years, and we have seen the conversations around China evolving very fast. And also we have covered many topics about China through different perspectives. So I would like you to recall from your memories, what was your favorite topics and what conversations have changed there?
So I guess, we can kind of pack a little bit the topics. We did a lot of economics, China's economic situation, impact on the world, a lot of EU-China economic relations, Belt and Road Initiative, basically China's relations with everything. We've done Japan, except for the US, which is interesting. We didn't do that one. There's too many of those. China with literally even the Balkans. I mean, and I think
the Gulf,
the Gulf,
Sri Lanka. Really looked into the global south.
So I think from a European standpoint, I think they're, sorry to say, very valuable because we forget this. We look at ourselves with our neighborhood, but we don't look at China in our neighborhood, or better, China and Europe in the neighborhood. Because, at the end of the day, we need to think of also synergies, how we can cooperate. And we were trying very hard to do that. And of course, there's many other topics like subject related, like innovation, but I would say my takeaway is that, first of all, when I wrote my first piece, I think on China, maybe 2005 or 6, the mantra was the same. China is decelerating structurally. And I still remember people would look at me like, are you crazy? But by now, the last podcast we had with Michael Pettis is like deja vu, at least for me and at least for the research that Bruegel produced on China. So in a way, I feel like we've kind of closed the circle. And not to say that the fact that China is decelerating structurally is by itself either a victory, by no means, or like a big issue. What we need to know is, okay, and then what? And I think that's what we've been trying to do in different podcasts and in our research. And I hope that, again, this is like objective enough not to take it as, again, a victory. On the contrary, a reality we need to build upon. And that's, to me, the best of our podcast, basically, that is factual and that it's not a containment instrument. It's not the opposite. It's really about facts and how it affects Europe. So I would say this is what we've done the best. And also not only China-centric, but world-centric, not US-centric, not US-China competition-centric. No, China in the world as we promised we would do.
Exactly. Just to add something on this, when we discussed about other countries and other regions, this really made this series, as Alicia just said, something that is about global economics nowadays. And trying to have this perspective and this lens about China's global role in the other parts of the world, to a certain extent, is also a reminder for Europe about the fact that the world is changing in a certain way that might require analysis and also perspectives from these other parts of the world. We're not speaking here just about China. And that's something that we did quite nicely in our podcast, always bringing voices from those countries. We had the Sri Lankan think tanker. We had expert from the Balkans. We tried really to combine these perspectives and really make it multi-layered, which is, I think, a really added value of Zhonghua Mundus comparing to other things that are around. Not to self-promote too much, but I think this is really an added value of that. And then for my topic, I can say that because it's more dear to my heart, the whole strand, the whole series of episodes that we dedicated to China's technological advance, and in general, the discourse about the future, these two things, which are not exactly the same, but they are kind of linked to each other. One became, at the beginning, it was quite of a techie kind of argument when we started to have some of the topics about China tech and so on. And then it became extremely geopolitical when then the rivalry with the United States exactly on semiconductors and on chips and electric vehicles now with Europe and so forth, like all these arguments. And then like it started also with an analysis that was more about regulatory. I remember this episode that we had about the new wave of China regulation on the digital sphere. I mean, like we tried even to this exercise of comparing GDPR, European GDPR, with what was going on in China with trying to limit the use of, for example, digital platforms for young people and this kind of stuff. So it was very mixed, and what we get out of it is really this connection between the rhetoric, the narrative about China's future, and the extreme link to the current policy and how this can move on in the future.
Just to add a takeaway from my part, which means, China's structural deceleration, but at the same time, ironically, China's increasing role in the world, because it is a bit ironic, isn't it? I think the key takeaway is for many of our guests who are not, especially the non-European guests, is where is Europe? And I want to repeat that again. Where is Europe? That question
This was the mantra question that we had at every single episode.
Exactly.
Where is Europe?
Where is Europe? And if it's only for that, I mean, basically, for me, it was worth to see that at every instance. And I want to add one thing. That question was not only to criticize Europe, it was more like, it's a mixture of where is Europe? I mean, shouldn't you be there given your size? But also, I wish Europe were there. I mean, there were two messages. And I think as a European, I truly believe that we need to listen to that reality that in a way, because we're not an hegemon, because we're not perceived as such, the fact that we come and, kind of stretch our hands is not necessarily seen as very aggressive. And I think, by listening to others saying that, I think we should realize that it's time to step up these efforts to be in there, and not necessarily only to compete with China. That's not the point, but to be there too, because it increases the options and the possibilities. And I think that was the biggest takeaway for me from our podcast.
Yeah. And do you think that Europe has changed to that direction that you wanted to?
No, I think Europe has changed something clearly since we started, because if you recall, Giuseppe, many of the podcasts were about industrial policy in China, China's, state capitalism, all of the model. Now people in Europe understand that model in and out, because in a way, partially economically speaking, we're replicating a model in many ways. Yeah, industrial policy, subsidies, economic security. So I feel like that part was kind of conveyed. Not that it happened because of our podcast, but basically it was. But the global Europe kind of idea is not yet there to me, very clearly. And maybe we need to, repeat the podcast and come back to that again.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with Alicia. I think that for how much we've been seeing this kind of assertive role of the European Commission in the past few years. The past year, let's put it like that, since Ursula von der Leyen made her famous de-risking speech. I think that we are still into a very reactive kind of mode. That's what I observe, is that every measure, it's somehow mirroring or mimicking the measures of the others, more on a defense way. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be doing defensive measures. What I'm trying to say is that what we fear to lack, if I also interpret what Alicia is saying and maybe thinking that we might think alike on this point, is really an assertiveness in order to be a leader or like taking the lead on a certain thing or going all the way on some of the convictions. For example, we still proclaim ourselves champions of multilateralism, but we have seen very little efforts to create a global initiative at the multilateral level, while China, for example, with the Global Development Initiative, has been using the multilateral system. On the other hand, we are not seeing, we are having a good analysis of our deficiencies in terms of risk side of the global value chains. We have a discussion about industrial policy, but it's mainly a discussion about defending old industry here in Europe, industry of the 20th century, not industry of the 22nd century. While we should be here, going back to my point about the future, we should also here in Europe build a narrative about the future, which is not only defensive, but also that could create somehow an action, maybe a little bit more of assertive and action at global level. So on these 2 points, I would have liked or would like still to see some more work to be done.
Thank you very much, both. And I've seen clearly that Giuseppe has an agenda for his next role. So maybe you want to tell us a little bit about where you'll be heading next.
Well, I'm going to head at the European External Action Service, working on their strategic foresight unit and dealing with geoeconomics. So pretty much the stuff that we've been discussing on a broader level here at Zongo Mundus. So I really think and hope to continue to work on these things, and this time from the inside. So maybe trying to poke a little bit the machine and trying to see what we can do more in that space.
And you're always welcome to come back and join us for another episode and to discuss all your research in your new position, right?
Well, yes, of course. If you and Alicia invite me, I will be happy to.
Of course, it will be, maybe we'll still be sitting here in this studio where you built from the first place. So thank you again, and congratulations to Giuseppe on this amazing new opportunity. And Alicia?
Yes, so maybe I would just like to end by saying that what Giuseppe just said, I hope you invite me here, is exactly what Bruegel is about, isn't it? It's about sharing experiences with policymakers, of course, the public as a whole, but certainly with policymakers, because at the end of the day, that's what we want to do, to improve policymaking. And this is why I think this series, podcast, and our newsletter is a way to wrap it up. China, there's so much out there, but we try very hard to make a simple point every time, and so that policymakers get that simple point. Last one we did was quite timely, Latin America, and basically with this sad title that basically China's influence in Latin America is not good news for the West. And again, this is not a zero-sum game. It's more about what we are losing anyway because of us. Because of us. So I think here the Giuseppe, you're always welcome, because the whole idea is that anybody doing policy for Europe should be welcome, because that's what we are trying to do, to change to the extent possible Europe's position in the world by looking at China and saying, okay, learning from China, by the way, also learning from China. So I hope this is useful in the future for you, Giuseppe, and your colleagues as well.
Thank you so much, Alicia.
Thank you. And for our listeners, you can find all our past editions of Zhonghua Mundus in the show notes. And don't worry, for us who are staying here, we will be continuing our conversation about China from Europe. Until next time, bye-bye.